The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of the South African Institute of International Affairs, once again joining us from Beijing, China. A very good evening to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon. Good evening. Good afternoon.
You're so used to saying good afternoon, but you're on my side of the world right now. Once again, Cobus has been in Beijing for the past week, attending the 2018 Think Tank Forum as part of the FOCAC on the run-up to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit that will happen in September in Beijing. And so very excited to have you on this side of the world for a second week in the row. Today, we're going to be talking about the theme of conferences, which is what brought you all the way over here. And we're going to take it from a different tack. So last week, we talked about think tanks and policy analysts who are in Beijing with you, people like you, Cobus. And we're going to talk about your former colleagues tonight in the academic world. And a couple weeks ago, there was a conference in Brussels, Belgium, where basically the who's who of the China-Africa scholarship got together. And it was absolutely fascinating because, Cobus, this is a space that is changing very, very quickly. A couple years ago, we did a show on the state of China-Africa scholarship and kind of who are the academics, the kinds of students. And there was a little bit of a concern that we raised in that show that it had stagnated a little bit. Programs were not advancing. Money was not going to universities. There was kind of a diminished interest. But that all seems to be changing now, and a new generation of PhDs is coming of age.
And it's very interesting because they're raising new issues and they're also raising some of the same issues but in new regions. So, it's very interesting because as we've pointed out in the past, some of the same issues that come up in China-Africa studies also affect China's relationship with the Caribbean or with South America. And some of these issues are now being raised in an academic forum as well.
And I'm really excited to be able to talk about this program in part because a lot of our listeners are students, are young people, are grad students who are thinking about a career in academics and thinking about where to go and what to do after they study and finish PhD programs. And so this is going to be a discussion about the state of China-Africa academics and scholarship. And we are thrilled to have back on a very, very old friend of the program. She's been on our show a couple times now, and she was actually one of our very first guests back when I was all the way in Paris when we had started the program in 2010 or 2011. Some of you may know Solange Guo Chaterlard. She is a longtime scholar of China-Zambia relations. You may actually know her as well from the Al Jazeera documentary, King Cobra and the Dragon. If you haven't seen that documentary, it is truly one of the best China-Africa documentaries. Still to this day, was actually produced somewhere around 2012, 2013, and it is really phenomenal. Solange, good afternoon to you from Paris, France. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back to the program.
Good afternoon, Eric, Cobus. Thank you so much for having me again on your program.
Oh, it is fantastic. So you are one of the organizers of this conference in Paris. It was called in Brussels, actually. Yeah. China, Africa in Global Comparative Perspective. Cobus, we need to work with these academics on their paper titling and their conference titling.
I have so much sympathy because I organized the earlier version of that conference in Nairobi a few years ago. And coming up with a title that includes everyone and it makes no one feel like they're being dissed is really hard.
But from a guy in marketing here,
yeah.
it just pains me that you guys put on all this work and have these kind of kludgy, clunky titles. But we'll get past the titles because the substance of it is what's important. Nonetheless, you had, let me just give a little bit of an introduction, and then we want to get for you to give us a full report. You had over 200 people attended the 3-day event.
Yes.
176 officially registered, so it was standing room only in Brussels, and you had 110 papers presented, 135 speakers, and some very interesting breakdowns on who was there. 44% of the attendees were from Europe, 21% were from the United States. Now, 65%, 2/3 are U.S. and European. Not surprising, given that that's been the trend in the past. 17% from Africa, 16% from China, and 2% from the rest of the world. So really a two-thirds from the white world and then 1/3 from everywhere else. Very, very interesting kind of breakdown. So Solange, that was the kind of backdrop to the conference. Before we get into kind of the trends that emerged from it and some of the ideas that came from it, why don't you give us a little introduction as to who came, what was the point of the conference, and just give us a feel for what happened.
Okay, I'll do that. I just want to make a few corrections on the statistics. And
a few corrections already.
No, but I'll use that as it's very interesting because what you highlighted there are the institutional nationalities. So indeed, we had about 43% European institutions, 20% American institutions, and we had more African institutions represented than Chinese. We had 19% African institutions, I'm talking about universities, 13% institutions in China, and the rest were other, so 2 to 4%, so very, very few. If you look at the actual nationality by participant, numbers really shift. We go down to about 30% European, 26% Chinese, and then an equal representation between Africa and the US. So what that means is that actually the Chinese are very much present in this conference. They constituted about 1/3, but they're hidden in the institutional numbers because they are speaking from a Western institution. So they're based in the US, they're based in Europe, etc. So that's why Africa is institutionally, it's a stronger representation than China. China is underrepresented in terms of institutions, but higher in terms of nationality because they're coming in through America and Europe. And then, and in terms of nationality, we actually had exactly the same amount of African participants as US. They both represented 19% in terms of nationality of speakers.
So were you happy with the breakdown of who attended?
I think we were pretty chuffed, actually. We were very happy because we had almost 1/3, if you like, from each continent. It was a very balanced, I think given the size of the conference and given the amount of traveling that required, a lot of financial assistance was rolled out to try and be as inclusive as possible. There were 40 people from 14 different African countries and many Francophone African countries who have been, let's say in the past, not represented in the CAC conferences that we've organized. So, it was very new. It was very new in terms of the size, in terms of the ambition, in terms of the topics that were raised and studied and examined and presented, but also in terms of the participation.
Yeah, I have to say, as someone who's been in the field for a while and is also who helped to organize one of these conferences earlier, that is amazing progress. It really is, and it also shows the complexity of China-Africa relations in the sense that a lot of the cutting edge work in China-Africa relations are being done by Chinese and Africans who are working in institutions around the world. And kind of exercising local networks or the networks that they grew up in to also push some of their research. So it's really encouraging.
I mean, to give you an example, we had, in terms of nationalities, we had 3 from South Africa, but we also had 3 from Algeria. I don't think we've ever had any Algerian nationals presenting in our conferences. We had 3 from Cameroon, 2 from Nigeria, 2 from Benin in West Africa, 2 from Zimbabwe, 1 from Ghana, 1 from Ethiopia, 1 from Zambia, 1 from Morocco, 1 from Togo, 1 from Senegal, 1 from DRC, and 1 from Ivory Coast. So we have a really nice representation: North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Southern, Central Africa. So I think that's a first, and we would really like this to continue. It's a bit of a milestone in terms of representation and participation in the whole politics of knowledge production, and we'd really like this to continue and be more inclusive as we move forward and as the field develops and matures.
Sure. So good variety and diversity of those who attended. In many ways, this is a break from the past of, I'll cut to the chase. Lots of white people getting together talking about China and Africa, which is what 100%. These conferences 15, 20 years ago really were. For no fault of anybody. I don't take that, away from anybody, but it is really healthy and wonderful to see that it is diversifying. Let's now kind of shift attentions to what were some of the ideas that came out of it. All this diversity, all this variety of people, differences, new, younger academics coming in with different ways of looking at the world. Talk to us a little bit about some of the papers that were given and the ideas that were shared.
Well, we had the traditional, South-South relations, geopolitics, migration, identities topics, which we've, been looking at for the last 10 years, the topics that keep coming up again and again. But I think what's really interesting is that the quality of the papers has definitely improved remarkably, namely because people are spending time on the field. They're also benefiting from the earlier studies that were conducted, so they can build on things that have existed already rather than sort of start off on their own. We've got a lot more comparative work, so countries that have never been brought into the fold that are being brought in, namely these countries in West Africa, for example. A lot of the Francophone countries are being brought into the fold. So that's really the quality is really what is different. We also have, we had a whole set of new topics. So, for example, we brought in the humanities this time. There was a panel on literature, which was a fascinating panel with people studying, literature in the original language. So we had, Algerian novels studied in Arabic, written in their original languages, where there would be Chinese Africans encounters. So we had a literature panel, we had a film panel, we had a photography panel, we had an environmental footprint panel, we had an animals and human relation panel. So we've really sort of stepped into a whole new field of topics. We've moved away from the more kind of traditional, big infrastructure, urbanization, kind of, neo-colonial narrative-driven topics, which are still very, very relevant and interesting. But we've moved into also slightly more, a broader, we've stepped into a much broader field where we're bringing in new subjects, which I think is the natural continuation of this phenomenon. If you want to understand, China's engagement in Africa, but around the world more holistically, on top of the infrastructure, urbanization, developmental model studies that we have, you have to look at things like, the environmental implications of that, or how the environment, affects local communities, or how does that change people's relationship to animals, to nature, to the world that they live in around them. I mean, things like that. So it's demonstration that there is active research in lots of different fields that hadn't been really given this kind of platform to show itself, to reveal itself. So I think that was very, very useful. And the fact that it was multilingual, I think, really helped broaden the whole spectrum of topics. So the fact that we had panels in French, people working on, in French-speaking African countries, or in Portuguese, Lusophone countries, that was also very, very welcome and fruitful, I found.
One of the interesting things of the conference was that it was being held in Brussels. Obviously academic conferences travel around the world and they pop up everywhere. But it seemed to me that there's something interesting about holding it in the heart of Europe. When Africa, of course, has such a long, fraught relationship with Europe, particularly with Belgium, can it be because of the history of the Congo? Its relationship with China throws up so many issues that also, touch on Europe in lots of complicated ways. So I was wondering, what was that experience like of talking China-Africa, but in the heart of Europe?
Well, I think it depends on which, perspective you look at it from. First of all, I think when we sent out the call for papers, we were really sort of overwhelmed with the responses. We had, hundreds of proposals, which we sort of weren't expecting. And that just shows that, Brussels was a center point. I mean, we found out that people were based in Europe. So African scholars, Chinese scholars were actually based in European institutions. And it made the traveling distances smaller, but also it was also quite convenient for a lot of the African participants that were connected to these sort of European capitals. So it was immediately, I think it was an attraction immediately for a lot of the participants being in Europe and being the heart of European institutions. That was one thing. It also put, from the perspective of Brussels, that it put Brussels, the ULB, the university that hosted it, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, where I'm a research associate at the moment and have been for the last 2 years, they were really excited about this project because they have all these new initiatives to try to unite kind of all the Africa scholars, interdisciplinary Africa scholars within my university. They had these 2 new initiatives, a new Africa initiative and a new Center for East Asian Studies. And this kind of conference allowed those 2 new initiatives to kind of come together in a wonderful way, So we had a lot of institutional administrative support from the university to help us organize this conference, which kind of got it off the ground in the first place. And they were very happy that kind of Brussels was put on the map, if you like, of the China-Africa story. The way that we try to include the whole Brussels and European dimension, sort of scientifically speaking, if you like, or from an intellectual point of view, is that we organized a public seminar which specifically looked at this kind of trilateral relations and how that evolved by inviting guests who specialize on this subject. For example, Anna Stahl, who's just published a book looking specifically at sort of EU diplomacy vis-a-vis China-Africa relations and how that has evolved it's evolved very, very fast, actually, because the nature of the relationship has evolved very fast. So we've try to, engage, bring in scholars who look at this topic and open that up for us. But we've also, on the same day as the public seminar, we organized a visit to the Royal Africa Museum in Tervuren, which is a very controversial museum. It remains very controversial. And it was essentially the kind of, window for colonialism for the Belgian king, the Belgian monarchy that wanted to promote the colonial enterprise in the Congo. And it's still standing today as, the Royal Africa Museum collection. And the museum has been closed for the last 4 or 5 years, undergoing renovations. It actually hasn't changed. The collection inside hadn't changed since the museum was set up at the start of the 20th century, or even at the end of the 19th century. So it was a really kind of this really interesting window into colonial and post-colonial thought and how much things hadn't really been engaged with, how there was a lack of, historical critical analysis and reflexivity vis-a-vis this historical past. So the museum has been closed for the last 4 years, specifically to undergo sort of radical transformation or so-called radical transformation in terms of, ideological repositioning, historical repositioning, thinking through the whole history, Belgian colonial history in a more critical way. So we were given an exclusive interview or access with the director of the museum, who spent an hour explaining to us the history of the museum and how it came about, its genealogy, how the museum has changed, the challenges that it faced, very real challenges, and how they're trying to address that. The museum collection hasn't actually been put out yet. The whole display, the curation hasn't been completed yet, but we were sort of explained how they sort of envisioned the whole thing, and we were taken around the whole estate basically and shown the rooms of the museums, even though there were only a few objects that were still left and that the objects hadn't actually been put out for display. I think it was very interesting because each side experienced it very differently because of the sensitivity of the subject. So some people were obviously very angry. Some people felt this was not satisfactory enough. Others, some Belgians thought, wow, this is a huge step forward compared to where we were 10 years ago. So the whole point wasn't to really kind of fix history, and repair all the wrongdoings. The point was to sort of confront a lot of these different audiences, a lot of the different stakeholders. So as intellectuals or as descendants of victims of the genocide, because it was a genocide, and as well as people who are curating this part of history, the people who have monopoly on collective memory, national memory, to bring them all together in one place and sort of confront them to each other and have an open dialogue. And I think one of the participants.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very bold move on your part to bring him to a museum, given the fact that these museums, I mean, they're basically trophy rooms for European colonialism
100%,
in many respects.
Yeah, it was a very controversial move. And I thought if we're going to do this in Brussels, we might as well, because there's an effort, there's a push, it's very slow. Everything is quite slow in Belgium. And they're certainly, I think, behind if you look at, I'm not saying the post-colonial thought and historical criticism is very developed in Britain or in France either, or in Italy either. But I think there's a lot more that these guys need to do.
Sure.
So I thought it was quite important because they're already going in this direction. So, to give them a sort of, an impression of where the rest of the world stands and where the rest of the world, all the rest of the, especially intellectuals and often very engaged intellectuals, stand vis-a-vis this position. So these issues and this history. And I think it was very important for both sides to meet each other, to confront. There were some very hard questions that were put out. One of the participants asked us to all have 1 minute of silence for the victims, the 8 million victims of the genocide, which basically made this place, possible. So, I think there was a lot of historical recognition in one way or another, and it was a start of a new kind of conversation on a new kind of basis. I think, as we say in France, on n'est pas encore sorti de l'auberge, which means we're far from having found a solution to the problem. But I think, these kind of events, these kind of moments, these encounters, these physical, personal encounters are really important to get, to move the dial forward on the, move the conversation forward and help so that the field can mature, and go in the right direction, at least, we hope.
Yeah, no, it sounds fascinating. I'm really sad that I wasn't there. It sounds amazing. In relation to the development of the field, what were some of the newer issues that came up, like the things that you hadn't heard at previous China-Africa conferences?
And if you could be as specific as possible with your answers, that would be great.
Oh, I'd have to look at the program again. But as I said, I think we had a very rich history panel, that tried to look at, different forms of, try to interpret different strands of socialism. So the Chinese socialisms, Tanzanian socialisms, Zambian socialism, how the Cold War politics, the ideological and the everyday politics kind of played out from a very local perspective. I think that was a very, very rich panel. As I said, again, the humanities, the literature panel was one of the first that explored China-Africa encounters in literature, so in contemporary literature across 5 or 6 different, countries. And I think that's also extremely innovative, because I think we can find a lot of answers in literature which we can't necessarily find in academic writing. There were some interesting papers on new forms of territorialization. So the idea that, China, operates, by, expanding its footprint, and they like to use these kind of, territorial words, the corridors of power, or, the belt, special economic zones, very physical, spaces. So people looking at how these different spaces meet, collide, sort of the grid meets the enclave, to how to try and understand these new forms of territorialization in very concrete terms through real concrete projects, wind farms, railway infrastructure, electricity grid. Natural resource extraction. I thought that was conceptually quite interesting and stimulating. But then we had also a lot of the importance on the invisible forms of influence, if you like, because there's, we often talk about China-Africa, we talk about what is very visible, what we can see, what is tangible, but there's a lot of intangible stuff like the gender politics, the everyday lives of people, things that you can't really, the invisible stuff that came through. We had a gender panel, which was also extremely interesting, which I think was innovative, where we had 2 papers looking at femininity, like how Chinese women experience their femininity in Africa, and how, African women experience their femininity in Guangzhou, in China. And then we had 2 papers on masculinities, like how African men experience their masculinity in China, and then how Chinese masculinities were represented in Africa. So it was a really interesting panel looking at really a new, not really, well, the topics have always been there, but they were given a lot of, scientific attention, and it came out in this panel. So those kind of things I think were very interesting. But that's there were 28 panels in all, so 28 panels plus 2 public seminars. So a lot of topics, subjects, and field were covered. So I invite people to have a look at the program and to look specifically at the topics.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa, or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
We're really just about out of time, but I want to get a sense, but I want to go back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the show. A lot of our listeners are either students or graduate students, or people thinking of becoming scholars in China-Africa relations. And I'd like to get your sense on what the conference, and you have almost 10 years of experience in this space. You're one of the most well-known China-Africa scholars out there. You've been on TV, you've published, you've done a lot. What advice would you have to young people who are thinking about going into scholarship, into the academia, want to get a PhD, they want to do something in this, based on what you saw at the conference? Tell us a little bit about your advice. And I mean, I'd like to put this in a little bit of context here. China studies in the United States, which I'm most familiar with, are under real challenge. Programs are being cut back. There's a lack of interest. There's not as many students. China studies used to be very, very popular in the 90s when China was booming and it was new. Now it's hard to get jobs over here. The pollution is really quite significant. China's become more of a strategic competitor, if not an outright hostile country to the United States. So it's not as popular.
Which it always has been, let's just be honest.
Yeah, fair enough. But even in Africa, there's funding problems at Stellenbosch, the long time, the long popular Center for Chinese Studies. And so these are difficult times for a lot of universities. And I'm curious, what's your advice in this context and based on what you saw for young people who are thinking about getting into this space?
Well, there are two things here, really. One is, advice for people who want to go into academia in general. And that would be the same advice, to anybody, whether you're studying China, Africa, or botany, or geology, is that, research is ultimately a publicly funded business, and if you're funded by the government and you're in education, you can be sure that there is going to be less and less money involved, which means it's going to be a more and more competitive environment, a more and more hostile environment for you to do sort of original, independent, cutting-edge research. So that, as a general state of affairs, of academia in general, is really important to get, very, very clear. So jobs are very hard to come across. You're going to be in long-term precarity, hopping from one short-term contract, maybe 3 months to 3-year contract to another. Full-time positions are few and far between, and they're being reduced. So you have to first understand how, how academia is financially structured to realize, to understand that it's a very, very precarious industry. It's a very precarious sector, which is entirely dependent on diminished and diminishing public funds. So, you have to be very, very, aware that if you're going to enter that field or enter academia in general, it's going to be a very, financially challenging. So what I would actually tell people is that...
Solange, let me just stop you right here. You are really not selling this well at all.
I'm just saying the truth. I'm telling the truth. I mean, there are two things.
It's true.
It's true. People need to understand this before they embark on long-term, scientific. You're investing your time, you're investing your money, and if you only find out about this when you're on your third postdoc, it's too late. Especially for the reality of women who spend most of their 20s and their 30s, chasing a career. And I've seen too many women who end up, at the age of 40, they still haven't got a job. They've sacrificed the golden age of having a family, etc. It's there's a lot of qu'on appelle des dégâts, negative externalities. And I think it's important for people to be aware of the kind of, the nature, that the precarious nature of this industry is extremely important. That said, it doesn't mean things are impossible. It doesn't mean you can't get projects off the ground. It doesn't mean it's an extremely rewarding thing to do. And it doesn't mean it's extremely valuable. And society needs people to try and produce objective, as objective as possible, sources of knowledge and question sort of what's going on. I mean, we need all of that, but we also need to realize and say it loud and clear that it's happening in a very, very disadvantageous environment, and this is everywhere the same. It's happening in Europe, in America, in Africa. It's, it's the same condition, if you like, and we need to be fully aware of the what this condition is, and then we can start operating and navigating in this field in an intelligent way. So that's the first side of it. This is the advice I would be telling people. As I said, this is what you're going to get into. It doesn't mean things are impossible. It doesn't mean that there aren't scholarships out there. That doesn't mean that there's budgets available. That doesn't mean that there aren't great people, great scholars that you should still sort of learn from, and grow from and then build on. That's all there, but you have to be very aware that the nature and the conditions of the field that you're entering. So that's the first thing. The second part is mainly on the subject itself. It's on the field. So you mentioned, what should these students take away about, how to study China, Africa? Well, I would have two recommendations. The first is really, really make sure that you nourish your experience, your personal, professional, but an academic experience on fieldwork. Data is gold. So, I would try to encourage people, even if you're working on macro issues or sociology, political science, diplomacy, really try and gather as much data as you can. Some things, are harder to get hold of. You can't always get to the source, but try and do as much as the research and the data production yourself rather than relying on other people's data. That's the first thing. So really root your research and your analysis in as much fieldwork as possible. So that's from a sort of a methodological point of view. Also, depending on your field, if you're a geographer, if you're an anthropologist, if you're a statistician, if you're an economist, you will gather different kinds of data in different kind of ways. Every discipline has its methodology, has its, code of conduct, ethical conduct, has its, for example, economists, they tend to do mass surveys. They want to collect a lot of data. Maybe interview lots and lots of different companies and do anonymous sort of randomized testing, whereas an anthropologist will tend to work with a smaller community, smaller crowd, and gain more kind of intimate, long-term interview qualitative data. So the data is different, and it'll be subject to different kind of scientific analysis and methodologies, but still where you're going out there and collecting the data and producing that yourself. I think that's the most valuable thing that you can add to the debate right now. It's the local kind of data. But the second thing is, I would say, and this is very important, is to with your data and your analysis, try to move beyond China-Africa. So China-Africa has to be your beginning, your base, and your topic that you're studying. But the phenomenon that you're looking at is a bit like physics, What are the fundamental dynamics of the processes that you're looking at? And that has to be beyond China-Africa. That has to be even beyond China and beyond Africa. That has to be social dynamics that can be applied to different parts of the world. And in fact, China-Africa as a field, and this is in a way the irony, is that yes, while we're sort of almost coming of age, and this conference is an example of that, so we're moving forward, we're developing, we're consolidating as a field, but we absolutely 100% need to avoid the studies trap. We can't become a China-Africa studies field like we have migration studies or gender studies or whatever. I strongly believe that we need to go beyond that. We have to be more ambitious. We can't be a China-Africa studies field. We need to be, a field that looks at social dynamics, that tries to understand fundamental principles of social and economic and political dynamics, and use China-Africa as a way, as a lens to find those answers, to ask the right questions and to find the interesting answers. So that's kind of what I would tell people. Yes, use China-Africa as your focus point, as your passion. But then when you're looking for the answers and you're looking for the questions, go beyond China-Africa. Go much, much, much further than and beyond that. And really, although I'm part of a China-African network, and we've been building this, we've been investing in this network for almost 10 years now. This is our 5th conference held in Brussels, but we also want to encourage, an intellectual growth that goes far beyond the China-Africa field. And we don't want to be restrained to a studies sort of, cottage industry. That is, at least from my personal perspective, that would be a failure if that's what we end up as.
I'm not sure if I should be incredibly depressed or super hopeful about the future here. But nonetheless, Solange, thank you for the insights. It sounds like it was an amazing conference. I was following it on Twitter. Thank you, Dan Large, who's one of the other greats of the China-Africa academic world. He was tweeting it during the conference, so I got to follow along.
Fantastic.
Yes, it was great. And so for those of us who couldn't come, so by the way, note for next year, have somebody tweet the whole thing, from top to bottom, because a lot of us were following on Twitter trying to see what was going on. So that was really excellent. And you guys deserve a lot of credit for what you did and for how you've moved things forward. And thank you so much for your advice for young people on what to do or maybe not to do. And I think if your parents out there listening to the show, you're probably going to discourage your kids from getting into academia. But nonetheless, we need you. We need you. We need academics. We need a new generation of thinkers.
Intelligent voices asking the right questions, certainly. Maybe not always coming up with the right answers.
More diverse voices. That's right. So Solange Guo Chaterlard is a PhD candidate herself, so she speaks of what she knows. She's joining us from Paris. Again, if you are not familiar with her, just Google Solange. I'll put a link. In fact, I'll put a Google link to all your work and all the things that you've done over the years. Highly recommend King Cobra and the Dragon. It was really just an amazing documentary which showed kind of a different side of China-Africa relations. It's 5 or 6 years old, but still absolutely relevant to today. If you haven't seen it, it's on Al Jazeera English. Go check it out. Just look it up. It's on YouTube as well. And you will see Solange traipsing through the Zambian countryside and through Lusaka, meeting presidents and then going to the people and everything in between. Also, Solange has been a commentator, a writer. She's published, she's organizing conferences. She's a super mom of 2, and so does that all in between everything. So thank you for a wonderful discussion, and we really appreciate your time.
That's very kind of you, Eric. That's very, very kind of you. But can I just mention that the Al Jazeera film is actually that came off the back of another film that we did for the BBC a couple of years earlier, which is called When China Met Africa. which some people may or may not have heard of, which is also looking at Chinese engagements in Africa. I think it was one of the first really kind of long documentaries on the topic. So that was the first kind of big film that I got involved in before doing the Al Jazeera one.
Well, we'll check them both out. Unfortunately, when China met Africa, they've been extraordinarily disciplined about making sure that none of it ever shows up on YouTube. So a lot of people, if you don't buy it, can't see
That's
it.
very true, yeah.
So that's unfortunate. We need to get the brothers who produced that to kind of release the rights a little bit so people can actually enjoy it now.
But if people listen back to the archives of our podcast, we did interview them. So yeah, there is somewhere deep back years ago in the China and Africa podcast archives. It's there.
That's right. That was a long time ago.
Terrible sound. We apologize in advance, but yeah.
7 or 8 years ago. That's really the old classic editions.
Yeah.
So once again, Solange, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to the next conference.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Eric. Thanks, Cobus. Great to be back on the show.
Okay, so while it was a little bit depressing at the end to hear how difficult the life of an academic is, which is no news to you, you know that. Boy, she did not really sell that in any kind of inspiring way, but it is important to know. I think she made a good point, though, in that sense.
I've been through that. But I think it's really important to know, because there is this kind of very old-fashioned idea about academia that it's essentially, well, you have summers off, it's a nice job. If you like reading books, it's not too stressful. That's over. Like, academia now is super intense, super competitive, super hardcore, and it's really good to know what you're getting into, because some people have very nice lives in academia. You need a specific kind of set of skills, and some of them are academic skills. You need to be excellent at that stuff, but there's a whole bunch of other kind of skills that you need to know whether it really is for you. And I think it's better to take a harder look at it and to decide very, very realistically about what you need, what kind of life you need, and then if it is for you, go for it.
But it's kind of an old way of thinking about it that if you pursue a PhD or even a master's to that, I mean, you want to do something academic, that you have to go into academia. You are a perfect example. Here you are, you are a former academic, you have a PhD, and you're in the think tank space. You can work for intelligence services, banks. Lucy Corkin, who is a former China-Africa scholar in South Africa, works in the financial services industry. I mean, there are lots of different ways that you can apply a PhD now that you couldn't 10 or 15 years ago. So I think we want to encourage people to pursue PhDs and higher learning on this, because there are so many different ways. And while there used to be one path, today there are a lot of different paths. I can tell you that.
Yes. So some of my friends who have PhDs in anthropology actually, were approached by ad agencies to do commercial research about particular kind of target markets, but from an anthropological viewpoint, for example. There's a lot of options. You just need to hustle. Like it's a hardcore hustling business. Kind of where self-promotion, media work, all of these kind of like all of the skills that live next to your research skills, those need to be exercised as well.
Yeah, the last point that I want to make, and this is something that I was thinking about throughout the time that Solange was talking, was this notion that came up a couple years ago, in that China may have an Africa policy, or now China has a Nigeria, a Botswana, a South African policy, but Africans don't have a China policy, in that sense that there isn't the deep understanding of China, the way that the Chinese are developing a much more sophisticated understanding of the individual African states that they're engaging with. And so now that we're starting to see the emergence of a new generation of young African scholars, particularly from places in North Africa and West Africa, where traditionally they haven't been as many as compared to, say, Kenya and South Africa, that's very, very exciting to me. And I'm hoping that the scholarship that they're starting to produce will start to filter its way into the policy process, the think tanks, and the understanding at the national level and the local level about how each country can engage China, hopefully on more equitable terms, and to have a healthier relationship down the road. I mean, that's really what we're all striving for.
Yes, and a lot of these people are coming out of institutions from all over the world. So a lot of them come out of Western institutions, and a whole bunch of them come out of Chinese institutions. So it's a very interesting mix, of perspectives, bringing a lot of different ideas about what China-Africa means to the table. And I think it's very exciting.
Well, it is very exciting. And if this is something that interests you, please, why don't you share some of your opinions, your experiences? Because as I said, we have a lot of people, a lot of students who are interested in this field. They write us quite often and ask us for advice on this. So we would like to hear from you. Are you in the China-Africa space? Are you taking a master's? Are you pursuing China studies or African studies at various universities and thinking about cross-pollinating the two? We would love to hear from you. This is a space that we will continue to kind of touch in with people like Solange and kind of keep people updated on what's happening. And again, congratulations to everybody involved in the conference. It was, from what everybody says on Twitter and of what Solange said, was a tremendous success, and great to see all these new voices that are coming into the space. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. Next week, Cobus will be back in South Africa. It's been wonderful to have him here in China, behind the Great Firewall. Cobus has been learning firsthand the difficulties that I have to endure in accessing the internet. So you'll be back in your free and open internet next week in Johannesburg. Until then, I'm Eric Olander for Cobus Van Staden. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.